The bell had barely stopped ringing when I felt 3 sets of eyes lock onto me from across the transit dock, and every muscle in my body went quiet and ready at the same time. My name is Mira Callahan, and I have spent the last 2 years pretending to be the most forgettable student at Kelvex Vocational Academy. I slouch when I walk. I flinch when the gravity plating shifts, even though it never bothers me. I laugh a half-second too late at jokes I already understood, because the aliens around me expect a human to be a little slow, a little soft, a little breakable. It is exhausting to be smaller than you are every single day. But it keeps you alive, and where I come from, alive is not something you take for granted. Kelvex sits on a quiet trade station near the edge of neutral space, a school built for a dozen different species who send their children here to learn engineering, navigation, and diplomacy far from their home wars. That is supposed to be safe. It is supposed to be boring. For almost everyone else, it is. I had just left my structural design class, my bag slung over one shoulder, half listening to my friend Kessa complain about a grading system she still did not understand. Kessa is our Vexi, tall and pale blue, with 3 jointed fingers that click softly together when she is annoyed, which is often. She has no idea what I really am. Nobody here does. That is the whole point. You are not even listening, Kessa said, giving my arm a light shove. I am, I said. You hate the professor. You always hate the professor. I hate this professor specifically. I smiled, and it was a real smile, because Kessa is one of the few good, uncomplicated things in my life right now. But even while I smiled, some old and careful part of my mind was already counting exits. That part of me never really turns off. It has been that way since I was a child. Where I grew up, you learn very young that the quiet moments are the dangerous ones, because anything can be waiting behind them. A storm, a predator, a stretch of ground that looks solid and is not. You learn to read a room the way other people read a book, scanning for the sentence that does not belong. And in the transit dock that afternoon, 3 sentences did not belong. They were standing near the far column, not quite together, not quite apart, the kind of spacing that only makes sense if you have been trained to look unremarkable while covering 3 separate lines of sight. 2 of them wore simple traveler's clothes, the kind that could belong to any merchant passing through. The third stood a little further back, arms loose at his sides, watching the crowd instead of any one person, the way someone watches for a target rather than a friend. I have seen that posture before. Not here, not at this school, but I have seen it. Mira, Kessa said, you have that face again. What face? The listening to something I cannot hear face. I laughed it off, told her I was just tired, and we kept walking, but I did not stop watching the reflection in the observation window as we passed it. The 3 figures had not moved. They had not looked away either. I told myself it was nothing. Station security here is decent. Bounty work is technically illegal within neutral trade zones, and Kelvex has enough political weight that most professional operators avoid it entirely. Technically illegal has never stopped anyone determined enough, though, and I have learned not to trust the word technically with my life. We reached the courtyard between the engineering hall and the dormitory wing, a wide open space with a broken skylight panel that the maintenance staff had been promising to fix since before I arrived. A heavy equipment rack stood near the wall, loaded with spare gravity stabilizers for the workshop classes, each one easily twice my body weight. I do not know exactly what made it happen. Maybe the panel finally gave out from age. Maybe someone bumped the rack without meaning to. What I do know is that 1 second the rack was standing still, and the next it was tipping forward, directly over a smaller student named Ori, who was crouched underneath it, searching for a dropped stylus and completely unaware. I did not think, I never do, in that half second before the body moves faster than the mind can argue with it. I crossed the distance in a way that should not have been possible for someone my size, caught the falling rack with both hands, and held it there, arms shaking not from strain, but from the effort of pretending to strain, while Ori scrambled out from underneath, wide-eyed and stammering thanks in a language I only half understood. A small crowd had gathered by the time I lowered the rack carefully back into place. Someone clapped. Someone else asked if I was hurt. I forced my breathing to sound ragged, forced my hands to tremble the way they would if I had actually needed every ounce of strength I owned, and said something about adrenaline making people do strange things. It worked. It always works. Nobody questions a lucky burst of fear strength from a small, soft human girl. They question a girl who lifts 3 times her own weight and does not even breathe hard afterward. Kessa hugged me, scolding me for being reckless, and I let her, grateful for the excuse to look shaken instead of calm. But as the crowd thinned and the maintenance drones arrived to inspect the rack, I looked back toward the transit dock, and my stomach turned cold and still, the way it used to back home when the wind changed direction and carried a scent that did not belong in the grass. The 3 figures were closer now. Not obviously, not in a way that would alarm anyone else, but they had crossed half the courtyard while everyone's attention was on the accident, and now they stood near the edge of the walking path, watching me specifically, no longer bothering to hide it from anyone paying close enough attention. Only I was paying that close attention. The one in the back, the one who had been reading the crowd instead of watching any single person, was now watching only me. I turned away first, deliberately, and kept walking toward the dormitory wing with Kessa at my side, chatting about nothing, laughing at the right moments, being exactly the harmless, forgettable girl I had spent 2 years building. Inside, my mind was already working through everything I knew. There had been rumors, quiet ones, passed between older students in low voices about a species called Deathworlders. Nobody at this school actually believed the stories, not really. They were treated the way ghost stories are treated anywhere, half joke, half unease, something you repeat at night to feel a small thrill and then forget by morning. Humans, some claimed, came from a world so hostile that everything on it wanted to kill you before breakfast. A world where the plants could poison you, and the animals could outrun you, and the ground itself could open up and swallow a person whole. Most people I had met assumed this was exaggeration, the kind of story primitive species tell about themselves to seem more interesting than they are. I had never confirmed or denied it to anyone. I simply let people believe whatever version made them comfortable. But somewhere out there, apparently, someone did believe it. Someone believed it enough to pay for proof. I said goodnight to Kessa at the dormitory junction, watched her disappear down her hallway, and then instead of continuing to my own room, I took the long way around, past the observation deck, past the darkened tutoring center, down through the lower concourse where the foot traffic thinned to almost nothing this late in the day. I was not running from them. I want to be clear about that, even in my own head. I was choosing the ground. Where I come from, you never let a predator pick the place where you meet it. You choose the terrain yourself. Somewhere you understand better than they do. Somewhere their advantages mean less and yours mean more. I had walked this station for 2 years. I knew which corridors had working cameras and which ones the maintenance staff had never quite gotten around to fixing. I knew which doors locked automatically and which ones stuck if you did not know the trick. I knew the sound the ventilation system made every hour on the hour, loud enough to cover footsteps, loud enough to cover almost anything. I slowed my pace just enough to be noticed, just enough to look distracted, checking my bag as though I had forgotten something, giving anyone following me an easy, obvious target to close in on. I did not look back to check if they had taken the bait. I did not need to. I could feel it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. That particular awareness that tells you exactly how many people are behind you and roughly how far, even without turning your head. 3 sets of footsteps, careful, trained, spreading out slightly to box me in from 3 angles instead of 1, the way people move when they have done this before and expect their target to bolt. They had made 1 mistake already, though they did not know it yet. They assumed I would run. I reached the maintenance corridor I had chosen, a narrow service passage between the old cargo bay and the recycling plant, poorly lit, mostly forgotten, with exactly 1 working camera that I happened to know pointed at the wrong angle to catch anything happening near the far wall. I stepped through the archway, letting my footsteps echo just a little louder than necessary, and then I stopped walking. I stood in the center of that quiet, dim corridor, facing away from the entrance, my bag still slung over one shoulder, my posture still soft and small and harmless. Behind me, I heard the footsteps stop as well. Then a low voice, translated smoothly through a small earpiece device, though the accent underneath it carried a texture I did not recognize. "You walk very calmly for someone alone this late," the voice said. I let a small, convincing tremor into my shoulders before I turned around. "I was just heading back to my dorm," I said, keeping my voice thin and uncertain. "Is something wrong?" The one who had spoken stepped into the dim light first, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a traveler's coat that did not quite hide the shape of equipment underneath it. Behind him, the second figure moved to block the corridor exit, unhurried, confident. The third, the one who had been watching only me back in the courtyard, stayed near the wall, half in shadow, a device already raised in one hand, small and dark, the kind of tool built for capturing rather than harming, at least not permanently. "Nothing is wrong," the lead one said, his tone almost gentle, the practiced gentleness of someone who has done this enough times to know that calm words work better than threats, right up until the moment they do not need to work at all. "We only need a few minutes of your time." I let my eyes widen, let my breathing quicken, let every visible signal say frightened, cornered, exactly what a lost, soft little human girl should look like, standing alone in an empty corridor with three strangers, closing the only way out. Inside, though, something very old and very calm had already taken over. I was counting the distance between us. I was noting the angle of the device in the third one's hand, the slight favoring of the lead one's left leg, the way the second one kept glancing toward the exit rather than toward me, more worried about someone walking in than about the girl he thought he had already caught. They had no idea what they were standing in front of. "Please," I said quietly, taking one small step backward, deeper into the corridor, exactly where I wanted to be, exactly where the shadows sat thickest and the walls sat closest, and every advantage they thought they had was about to mean absolutely nothing at all. The lead one smiled and stepped forward to close the distance. And somewhere underneath my calm, frightened expression, a small, quiet part of me almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My pulse did not rise. That is the part I could never explain to anyone here, even if I wanted to. Fear, the kind that speeds the heart and shakes the hands, is a survival tool, and survival tools only fire when the brain believes there is a real chance of losing. My body had stopped believing that a long time ago, in places far worse than this quiet corridor. What I felt instead was something closer to focus, a narrowing of the world down to distances and angles and timing, the same feeling I used to get as a child crossing open ground back home, when a wrong step meant something with too many teeth would notice you before you noticed it. The lead hunter closed the last few steps between us with easy, confident strides, the kind of walk that belongs to someone who has never once had his confidence tested. Up close, he was taller than me by a full head, broad enough that his coat strained slightly at the shoulders, and he carried himself with the loose readiness of someone trained for exactly this kind of work. His eyes, a pale amber color, moved over me the way a buyer studies livestock, assessing, cataloging, already imagining the value I represented to whoever was paying for this. "There is no need to be frightened," he said, his translated voice smooth and unhurried. "We only need you to come with us quietly. If you cooperate, none of this needs to be difficult." I let my lower lip tremble slightly. "Come with you where? I do not understand what is happening." Behind him, the second hunter, shorter and more heavily built, had drifted a few steps closer to the exit, arms crossed, clearly the one meant to block any attempt at escape. The third, the quiet one near the wall, had not moved at all, the small device in his hand angled toward me, patient, waiting for a signal. "Somewhere your kind is valued," the lead hunter said, and something in the casual cruelty of that sentence, spoken so lightly, so comfortably, settled the last of my hesitation into something colder and much more certain. I have never enjoyed hurting anyone. I want that understood clearly, because it matters, at least to me. But there is a particular kind of anger that only rises when someone treats you like property, like a resource to be collected and sold, like your entire existence is worth nothing more than whatever price someone else attaches to it. That anger does not make you reckless. If anything, it makes you very, very precise. Somewhere I am valued, I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the dim corridor. That is an interesting way to put it. The lead hunter's smile flickered, just slightly, some small instinct in him registering that my voice no longer sounded quite as frightened as it had a moment ago. But instincts are only useful if you listen to them in time, and by the time his hand moved toward whatever tool waited beneath his coat, it was already too late for that. The net came from the quiet one at the wall, fired without warning, a wide mesh of dark, flexible cable designed to expand and tighten around a target the instant it made contact. I heard the soft hiss of its release and felt it settle over my shoulders and arms a half-second later, already contracting, already meant to bind me helpless in place. I let it catch me completely. This confused them, I could tell, even in the half-second of silence that followed. A trained target fights a net immediately, thrashes against it, wastes energy trying to escape before the mesh fully tightens. I did none of that. I simply stood there, arms loosely bound at my sides, head slightly bowed, exactly the picture of someone who had given up. "Good," the lead hunter said, some of the tension easing from his shoulders as he stepped closer, reaching for a restraint device at his belt. That was easier than expected. It was, in fact, exactly as difficult as I had planned for it to be. The material of the net was strong, built to hold most species several times my apparent size, tested against creatures far larger and presumably far stronger by galactic standards. It was not, however, built with any real understanding of what a human body is actually capable of when it stops pretending otherwise. I flexed once, a slow, deliberate pull outward with both arms, and felt the fibers strain, then stretch, then begin to fray at a seam near my left shoulder that had clearly never been tested against this kind of force before. The lead hunter's hand froze halfway to his belt, his amber eyes widening slightly as the sound reached him, a low, tearing groan of fibers giving way that should not have been possible from someone my size. "That is not," he started to say, and did not finish the sentence, because by then I had already broken free. The net fell away in pieces around my feet, and for one full second nobody in that corridor moved at all. The lead hunter stared at me the way people stare at something that has just proven every assumption they carried into a room to be completely wrong. The second hunter's arms uncrossed slowly, his weight shifting backward half a step. The third, still near the wall, fumbled for something else at his belt, his composure cracking for the first time since I had noticed them back at the transit dock. "She is not restrained," the second hunter said, his voice tight, translated a fraction too fast to hide the alarm underneath it. "I noticed," the lead hunter answered, already reaching for something else beneath his coat, some backup tool meant for exactly this kind of failure. But hesitation, even a half-second of it, is a luxury nobody gets to keep in a fight, and I had already closed half the distance between us before his hand found whatever he had been reaching for. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think it matters, even now, even telling this story only inside my own head. I did not want to seriously hurt any of them. Where I come from, that kind of restraint is not weakness, it is discipline. The difference between someone who fights because they have to and someone who fights because they enjoy it. I have never wanted to be the second kind of person, no matter how easy it might have been in that corridor, no matter how much they deserved, far worse than what they got. So instead of striking to injure, I struck to disable, quick, controlled movements meant to take away tools and options rather than break anything that could not be repaired. I caught the lead hunter's wrist before his hand ever cleared his coat, twisted just enough to force his fingers open, and the device he had been reaching for clattered uselessly against the floor. He made a short, surprised sound, more startled than hurt, as I used his own momentum to redirect him sideways into the corridor wall, firm enough to knock the breath from him, gentle enough to leave nothing broken behind. The second hunter reacted faster than I expected, lunging forward with a short baton that crackled faintly with some kind of stunning charge along its edge. I sidestepped the swing with room to spare, caught his extended arm, and used the same trick I had used 100 times in training back home, redirecting force rather than opposing it directly, letting his own weight carry him past me and down onto one knee, the baton skittering harmlessly across the floor. "Stop!" he gasped, more confused than commanding, as though the word alone might reset whatever was happening in front of him. I did not stop. Not because I wanted to hurt him further, but because the third hunter, the quiet one, had finally recovered enough to raise a second device. This one clearly meant for something more permanent than a net, and I was not willing to give him time to use it. I moved toward him before he could steady his aim, and for one brief, strange moment, I saw real fear in his expression, the specific fear of someone who has hunted many things in his life and has never once considered that something he was hunting might turn around and simply be better at this than he was. The device fired anyway, a narrow beam that I avoided by dropping low and driving forward, catching him just below the ribs with enough force to fold him over, without any lasting harm, and pulling the device free from his hand before he even registered that I had reached him. For a moment, the corridor was silent except for uneven breathing, none of it mine. The lead hunter had pushed himself up against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, staring at me with an expression that had shifted entirely from confident predator to something far more uncertain. The second knelt on the floor, cradling his arm, glancing toward the exit as though calculating whether he could actually reach it. The third sat slumped against the wall where I had left him, still catching his breath, the device I had taken from him now resting harmlessly in my own hand. None of them said anything for a long moment. I did not either. I simply stood there, breathing evenly, my expression calm in a way that seemed to unsettle them far more than any amount of shouting could have. "What are you?" the lead hunter finally asked, his voice quiet now, stripped of all its earlier ease. I considered several answers. In the end, I gave him the simplest one, because it was also the truest. "Something you were never prepared to meet," I said. "You should have brought more of you." He did not respond to that. None of them did. And somewhere underneath the adrenaline that still had not fully arrived, some small, careful part of my mind was already moving on to the next problem, because defeating them here, in this quiet corridor, was only ever going to be the easy part of tonight. The much harder part was making absolutely certain that nothing about this ever became something anyone else could prove. For a moment, none of us moved, and in that stillness I found myself studying all three of them the way I had once been taught to study anything dangerous, not with anger, but with patience, because patience tells you far more than fear ever does. The lead hunter recovered first, which did not surprise me. Men like him, whatever species they belong to, tend to rebuild their confidence quickly, because their whole identity is built on being the most dangerous thing in any room they enter. He straightened away from the wall, one hand still pressed lightly against his ribs, and reached slowly toward an inner pocket of his coat, his eyes never leaving mine. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice steadier now, though I could hear the strain underneath it. "This does not need to become a fight you cannot win." "I think it already became exactly that," I said, "about 90 seconds ago." Something flickered across his face, somewhere between irritation and disbelief, and then his hand finished its motion, pulling free a small cylindrical device that hummed faintly to life the moment it left his pocket. I recognized the shape immediately, not from any specific memory, but from the particular way he held it, the careful, respectful distance he kept it from his own body. Whatever it was not meant to simply restrain. "Last opportunity," he said quietly. I did not answer him with words. I answered by closing the distance between us before he could finish deciding how to use it. He was fast, I will give him that much credit. Faster than the other two, more experienced, more willing to commit fully to a strike rather than hesitate the way fear makes most people hesitate. The device came up in a short, controlled arc, meant to catch me across the shoulder, and if I had still been playing the role of frightened, harmless student, it likely would have. But I was done playing that role for tonight, and the difference between those two versions of myself was, in that moment, the difference between him succeeding and him failing completely. I caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted with exactly enough force to make his fingers open involuntarily, and the device spun away from us both, clattering somewhere into the darker end of the corridor. He tried to pull free, throwing his weight backward, but I held on, using his own momentum against him, the way I had been taught since before I could properly remember being taught anything at all, redirecting rather than resisting, letting his strength work against him instead of meeting it directly. He hit the wall hard enough to force the air from his lungs, sliding down it slightly before catching himself, and for a moment, he simply stared at me, chest heaving, some final piece of his confidence finally, completely gone. "You are not registered anywhere," he said, more to himself than to me, as though trying to make sense of a fact that refused to fit inside anything he understood. "There is no record of a Deathworlder capable of this." "There is now," I said. "You are just not going to remember it long enough to tell anyone." Behind me, I heard movement, quick and low, and turned in time to see the second hunter, the broad, heavily built one, lunging forward again despite his injured arm, apparently deciding that desperation was worth more than caution at this point. He swung wide, a clumsy, powerful strike aimed at knocking me off balance rather than technically defeating me, the kind of attack that relies entirely on brute force overwhelming skill. It might have worked, against someone smaller in spirit than I have had to become. I stepped inside his swing instead of away from it, closing the distance so his longer reach became useless, and drove my palm firmly into his chest, timed to catch him mid-motion, off balance, weight already committed forward with nowhere left to redirect it. He staggered backward, tripped over his own retreating feet, and landed hard against a stack of storage containers lining the corridor wall, several of them tumbling down around him with a series of hollow, echoing crashes. He did not get back up immediately. When he did, it was slowly, one hand braced against the wall, clearly reconsidering every decision that had led him to this particular corridor on this particular night. The third hunter, the quiet one who had fired the net earlier, had used the distraction to circle wide, attempting to reach the device I had taken from him, now resting near my feet, where I had dropped it during the earlier exchange. I let him get close enough to believe he might actually succeed, because sometimes the fastest way to end a fight is to let your opponent commit fully to a plan that was never going to work in the first place. He reached down for the device, fingers almost closing around it, and I simply stepped on top of it first, my weight settling calmly, patiently, while he knelt there, hand still outstretched, staring up at me with an expression that had moved well past fear into something closer to disbelief. "Please," he said quietly, and it was the first honest thing any of them had said to me all night. "We were only told you would be difficult. Nobody said anything about this." "Difficult," I repeated, almost gently. "That is one word for it." I could have ended things there. In many ways, I already had. 3 trained hunters scattered across a narrow maintenance corridor, none of them capable of continuing this fight. All of them finally understanding, far too late, exactly what kind of mistake they had made in choosing me as their target. But the lead hunter, still braced against the wall behind me, apparently had one final piece of pride left to spend, because I heard his footsteps a half-second before I felt the air shift near my shoulder, and turned just in time to avoid a strike that would have caught me directly across the back of the head. "Enough," I said, and for the first time that night, I let a fraction of the frustration I had been carefully containing bleed into my voice. He did not stop. Some part of him, whatever pride or professional obligation still burned underneath the fear, refused to accept defeat quietly, and he came at me again, faster this time, more reckless, throwing aside whatever caution had guided his earlier attacks. I met him without hesitation, because hesitation, at this point, would only prolong something that needed to end. The exchange that followed was short, and it was, if I am honest, almost disappointing in how quickly it concluded. He swung. I redirected. He tried to grapple. I used his own weight to guide him past me, letting momentum finish the work my own strength barely needed to contribute. Within a handful of seconds, he was on the ground, one arm pinned harmlessly behind his back, his breathing ragged, his earlier confidence completely, thoroughly gone. "Stay down," I said quietly. "I am asking politely, once." He stayed down. For a long moment, the corridor held nothing but the sound of 3 sets of uneven breathing, and my own, calm and steady, the way it always eventually settled once a fight had fully run its course. I released the lead hunter's arm, stepped back, and allowed myself, finally, one full breath of something close to relief, though even that felt cautious, incomplete, aware that the fight itself had only ever been the smaller half of tonight's problem. I looked at each of them in turn, spread across the corridor floor in various states of defeat, none of them seriously harmed, all of them thoroughly humbled. It mattered to me, even then, that none of this had gone further than it needed to. I have met people, and things far worse than people, that would have used this moment differently, that would have taken what these 3 intended for me and returned it tenfold, simply because they could. I have never wanted to become someone who thinks that way, no matter how many good reasons the galaxy occasionally hands me to consider it. "Why?" the second hunter asked, from where he sat against the fallen containers, still cradling his arm, his voice quieter now, almost curious beneath the pain. "Why are we all still breathing?" It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself more than once over the years, in situations far more serious than this one. "Because that is not who I choose to be," I said simply, "even for people like you." None of them answered that. Perhaps there was nothing left to say. Perhaps, for the first time since they had entered this corridor with such easy confidence, they finally understood that the girl they had come to collect was never the frightened, breakable thing they had been told to expect, and that the real danger tonight had never been a lack of mercy on my part, only an abundance of skill they had badly, badly underestimated. I crouched down near the lead hunter, who watched me approach with wary, exhausted eyes, no longer bothering to hide how thoroughly this encounter had unsettled him. "Whoever hired you," I said quietly, "you are going to disappoint them." "They will send others," he said, though there was little conviction left in the words. "Maybe," I said, "but not tonight, and not with any proof that tonight ever happened at all." I stood, looked around the dim, cluttered corridor, at the torn remains of the net, the scattered devices, the fallen containers, the 3 defeated hunters who had walked in here so certain of an easy outcome and were leaving with a very different education about the world they had chosen to hunt in. The fight, I already understood, had been the simple part, cleaning up everything it had left behind, quietly, completely, without a single trace surviving to tell anyone else what had happened here tonight. That was going to require an entirely different kind of skill. Fortunately, it was one I had also spent a great deal of my life learning. I have always found it strange how quickly a fight can end and how long the cleanup afterward can stretch, as though the universe insists on balancing the scales somehow, giving you 30 seconds of danger and 30 minutes of careful, tedious work to make certain that danger never catches up with you later. I started with the 3 of them, still scattered across the maintenance corridor, none of them in any condition or willingness to try anything further. I checked each one briefly, not out of concern for their comfort, but because I needed to know exactly what condition they were in before I decided what came next. The lead hunter had a bruised set of ribs and a badly wounded pride, nothing that would not heal within a week. The second had a strained arm that would need proper rest, and the third, aside from a sore stomach and an even sorer sense of professional failure, was largely unharmed. Satisfied that I had not caused anything permanent, I turned my attention to the equipment they had brought with them, because equipment, unlike people, does not get to walk away and quietly forget what happened. The net they had used lay in torn pieces near the center of the corridor, and I gathered every scrap of it carefully, checking the fibers for any embedded tracking marker or recording thread, the kind of thing professional operators sometimes weave into their gear in case a job goes wrong and someone else needs to reconstruct what occurred. I found one, small and nearly invisible, stitched along the inner seam, and removed it with the same careful patience I would use handling something that might still bite. The device the lead hunter had drawn, the one that had hummed with quiet menace before I sent it skittering into the shadows, took longer to locate. I finally found it wedged against a ventilation grate near the corridor's far end, still faintly warm, its small display screen flickering with a diagnostic readout I did not fully understand but recognized as dangerous regardless. I powered it down, removed what appeared to be its primary storage core, and set the rest aside to deal with later. "You are very thorough for someone who claims not to enjoy this," the lead hunter said quietly from where he sat, watching me work with a kind of exhausted fascination. "I do not enjoy the fighting," I said, not looking up from the device in my hands. "I have simply learned that surviving the encounter is only half the job. Surviving what comes after it matters just as much." He did not respond to that, though something in his expression suggested he understood it better than he wanted to admit. I moved next to the corridor itself, examining the single working camera mounted near the entrance, the one I had already known pointed at the wrong angle to catch anything happening near the back wall where most of tonight's events had unfolded. Even so, I could not afford assumptions, not with something this important, so I approached the small housing carefully and reviewed its stored footage through a simple diagnostic panel built into its base, the kind maintenance staff use for routine checks. As expected, the footage showed only the entrance to the corridor, myself, and the 3 hunters walking in, nothing beyond that point, the angle cutting off well before anything meaningful occurred. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly the outcome I had planned for weeks ago, back when I first mapped every blind spot and forgotten corner of this station, never quite believing I would need this particular knowledge so soon, but never willing to stop gathering it either. Even so, I could not simply leave the footage of us walking in together sitting there, waiting for someone curious to notice it. I adjusted the timestamp data slightly, just enough to blend our entry into a longer stretch of unremarkable foot traffic that occurred earlier in the evening, the kind of small, quiet alteration that would never trigger automated review, the kind that only someone looking very specifically for it might ever notice, and even then, only if they already knew exactly what they were looking for. With the camera handled, I turned to the hunters themselves, and this was, admittedly, the part of the evening I found least comfortable, though not because I doubted my ability to manage it. Among the equipment the 3rd hunter had carried was a small device I recognized immediately as a memory suppression tool, the kind used by professional operators to erase short windows of a target's awareness when discretion mattered more than force. It was, I imagined, meant originally for use against me, a backup plan in case their initial approach failed to secure a quiet, cooperative capture. There was something almost fitting about using it instead for exactly the opposite purpose. I explained none of this to them as I worked, mostly because there was little point. The lead hunter watched with a kind of resigned understanding, the second simply closed his eyes, and the third, ever the quietest of the group, offered no resistance at all, perhaps recognizing that resistance had stopped being useful for any of them the moment I first stepped out of that torn net still standing. The device worked exactly as its design suggested it should, dimming the last 20 minutes of clear memory in each of them, replacing sharp recollection with a soft, uncertain haze, the kind that would leave them with only a vague sense of confusion and perhaps a mild headache, nothing they could describe with any confidence to an employer demanding answers. Once that was finished, I turned my attention to the corridor itself, arranging the fallen storage containers to suggest an accidental collapse rather than any kind of struggle, scattering a few tools nearby that maintenance staff routinely left lying around this section of the station, and scuffing the dust along the floor in a pattern that told a much more boring story than the truth. The three hunters, still hazy and unsteady, offered little resistance as I helped each of them toward the nearest transit dock, moving slowly, deliberately, timing our path to avoid the handful of security patrols I knew still operated at this hour. It was not difficult. Difficult had already happened tonight, and this, by comparison, felt almost gentle. At the dock, I flagged an outbound medical transport already scheduled to depart within the hour, using a public terminal to submit an anonymous concern about 3 passengers appearing disoriented and unwell, the kind of report that triggers routine, low-priority assistance rather than any serious investigation. Within minutes, station medical staff arrived, calm and efficient, gently guiding all 3 hunters aboard for evaluation, none of them protesting, none of them capable of explaining clearly why they felt as strange as they did. I watched from a distance as the transport doors closed, carrying them toward a destination 2 systems away, far from Kelvex, far from me, and further still from any proof that tonight had ever happened the way it actually had. Only once the transport had fully departed did I allow myself to walk back toward my dormitory, my pace unhurried now, my breathing calm, my hands steady in a way that would have surprised anyone who understood exactly what those hands had been doing less than an hour earlier. Kessa was waiting near the common room when I arrived, curled into one of the reading chairs with a study tablet balanced on her knees, and she looked up the moment I entered, her expression shifting immediately into concern. "You look tired," she said. "Where have you been?" "Helping with the equipment cleanup after that accident earlier," I said, the lie coming easily, smoothly, the way it always did after so much practice. "Took longer than expected." She studied me for a moment, the way she sometimes did when something about my explanation did not quite add up in her mind, though she never seemed able to identify exactly what felt wrong. Finally, she simply nodded, apparently deciding whatever tiredness she saw in my face was explanation enough on its own. "You should rest," she said. "You have that look again." "What look?" "The one that says you carried something heavy tonight." I smiled at that, small and a little sad, because she was closer to the truth than she realized, even if she would never fully understand it. "I am fine," I told her, and let her believe it, because that, more than anything else tonight, was the lie I had spent 2 years perfecting. I reached my room a short while later, closed the door quietly behind me, and stood alone in the dim light for a long moment, running through everything one final time. The corridor was staged, the footage was adjusted, the hunters were gone, their memories clouded, their proof erased before it ever fully existed. Nothing remained to connect tonight's events back to me, nothing except my own memory of exactly how close it had come to going very differently, and exactly how far I had been forced to reach into the parts of myself I usually kept carefully, quietly hidden. I sat down on the edge of my bed, finally alone, finally free of the need to perform calm for anyone else's benefit, and only then did I notice how badly my hands had begun to shake. It is strange, the way fear arrives late sometimes, patiently waiting until every real danger has already passed before finally showing itself. I had faced 3 trained hunters without my pulse rising once, had moved through the entire fight with a calm that surprised even me, and yet here, alone in my quiet dormitory room, hours after any of it mattered, my hands trembled as though the danger were only just beginning. I let them shake. There was no one left to perform for, no audience requiring a brave, steady version of myself, and I had learned long ago that pretending strength in front of others only works if you allow yourself somewhere private to stop pretending afterward. I sat there for a long while, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline finish draining out of me the way a storm finally empties itself of rain, until my hands stilled and my thoughts grew quiet again. I thought about the 3 hunters, somewhere on a transport now, drifting further from Kelvex with every passing hour, carrying home a story none of them could fully explain and no evidence anyone would believe even if they tried. I thought about whoever had hired them, some unseen buyer with enough resources to fund a professional retrieval team, someone who apparently believed the old stories about Deathworlders enough to invest real money chasing proof. I wondered, briefly, what they would tell that buyer, and decided it likely would not matter much either way. A failed contract with no explanation was still simply a failed contract. One more entry in a long list of retrieval attempts that quietly went nowhere. I did not sleep well that night, though I did eventually sleep, the kind of shallow, watchful rest that never fully lets go of awareness, old habits refusing to loosen their grip even in the safety of a locked dormitory room. I woke before my morning alarm, as I usually did, and went through the motions of an ordinary day with the same practiced ease I had used for 2 years now, slouching slightly as I walked, laughing a half-second late at Kessa's jokes, letting the world see exactly the soft, unremarkable version of myself it expected. Nobody at Kelvex ever mentioned 3 missing hunters. There was no announcement, no investigation, no ripple of concern moving through the student population. As far as the station's official records were concerned, nothing unusual had happened at all last night, beyond a minor equipment malfunction in an old maintenance corridor and 3 visiting travelers who had experienced sudden, unexplained disorientation before departing on a scheduled medical transport. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly the outcome I had worked so carefully to create, a night that left behind no proof at all that anything dangerous had ever occurred. And yet, 3 days later, something small happened that told me at least one person here understood far more than they were letting on. I found it in my locker between classes, a thin data chip resting quietly on top of my books. No note attached, no explanation offered. I recognized the storage format immediately as station security equipment, the kind used to archive footage from the observation network across Kelvex. My first instinct was concern, sharp and immediate, wondering if somehow, despite every precaution, a piece of proof had survived after all. I waited until I was alone in my room that evening before examining it, my old careful instincts fully awake again, treating the small chip with the same caution I might treat any unknown device left somewhere it should not have been. What I found, once I finally reviewed its contents, was not proof at all. It was an absence of proof, deliberately documented. The chip contained a short log, timestamps listing exactly the window of time during which the confrontation in the maintenance corridor had occurred, alongside a notation confirming that footage for that period, across every camera in that section of the station, had been found corrupted or missing entirely. There was no explanation attached, no accusation, no request, only the quiet, careful documentation of exactly what I already knew to be true, presented to me by someone who clearly understood precisely what that missing footage meant and had chosen, for reasons of their own, not to report it further. I sat with that small chip for a long time that night, turning it over in my hands, thinking about the proctor who had always watched me a little too closely during my 2 years here, the one whose eyes seemed to linger a half-second longer than casual interest usually required, the one who never quite bought into my careful performance of harmless fragility the way everyone else seemed to. I did not know, even now, whether this was a warning, a message, or simply an acknowledgement passed quietly between 2 people who both understood something the rest of the station did not. Perhaps it was some combination of all 3. What I did know was that somewhere at Kelvex, someone had looked closely enough to notice what I truly was, and had chosen, at least for now, to keep that knowledge exactly as private as I had spent 2 years trying to keep it myself. I never learned who exactly delivered that chip. I never asked, and it was never mentioned to me directly, not that week, not in the weeks that followed. Life at Kelvex continued much as it always had, lessons and assignments, and Kessa's endless complaints about grading systems, the ordinary rhythm of a place that still believed itself boring and safe. I continued my quiet performance, slouching through hallways, letting people underestimate exactly what I was capable of, because that performance had kept me alive for 2 years now, and I saw no reason to abandon it simply because 3 hunters had briefly, badly failed to understand its purpose. But something had shifted, quietly, underneath the surface of my careful routine, even if nothing about my daily life outwardly changed. I understood now that being underestimated was not the same thing as being unseen. There was, apparently, at least one person on this station paying close enough attention to notice the difference between a lucky accident with a falling equipment rack and something far more deliberate happening in the shadows afterward. That knowledge did not frighten me, not exactly, though it did change the way I thought about safety here, adding one more layer of careful awareness to a mind that already carried far too many. I thought, too, about the hunters themselves, wherever they had ended up, and wondered whether they would ever try something like this again, against me or against anyone else who happened to carry the wrong reputation across the wrong section of space. I hoped, honestly, that they would not out of any lingering concern for them personally, but because I understood better than most exactly how dangerous it was to underestimate something simply because it did not look the way you expected danger to look. That, I had come to realize, was the real lesson buried underneath everything that had happened, one I had known instinctively long before I ever set foot on this station, but one that tonight's events had sharpened into something clearer, something I would carry forward far more deliberately than before. Blending in had never really been about hiding weakness. I had spent 2 years telling myself otherwise, convincing myself that the slouched shoulders and delayed laughter and careful, constant performance of fragility were simply survival tools, ways of avoiding attention I could not afford to attract. But standing in that maintenance corridor, facing 3 hunters who had come specifically because someone believed the stories about what I truly was, I understood the deeper truth underneath all of it. Blending in was never about hiding what I had survived to become. It was about making absolutely certain that nobody could ever prove it, no matter how closely they looked, no matter how carefully they searched, no matter how confident they were walking in that they had finally found something soft and breakable and easy to take. They had not found that. They would never find that here, not from me, not while I remained careful enough to erase every trace of proof before it had the chance to matter. I placed the small data chip carefully into a hidden compartment inside my desk, the same place I kept the other few reminders of who I truly was beneath the careful performance, and turned off the light, finally ready to rest. Outside my window, the station continued its quiet, ordinary rhythm, unaware of how close it had come to losing one of its most unremarkable students to hunters who had badly, fatally underestimated exactly what unremarkable could mean. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since that corridor, allowed myself to fully believe it was over, at least for tonight. Tomorrow, I would slouch through the hallways again, laugh a half-second too late, let the world see exactly the soft, harmless girl it expected to see. And somewhere beneath that careful, patient performance, the truth would remain exactly where I intended it to stay. Hidden, protected, and, for anyone foolish enough to come looking for proof of it again, permanently, quietly, out of reach.